Hello, and welcome to our webinar to introduce the third Agile Testing Micro-Credential. This one is all about making Agile work in the real world, and it's very much focused on testers and how testers can affect the success of an Agile project. Now, there are three micro-credentials in this set. There's the Agile concepts, there's implementing Agile, and there's this one that we're talking about today, making Agile work in the real world. Now, in the Agile concepts, which is really the first micro-credential, we talk about the goals of the Agile methodologies, a little bit about the basics of Agile, talking about the manifesto, what were the goals, what were they trying to achieve, how to make Agile successful, a lot about the risks and the benefits with Agile methodologies, and then the different types and usages, because there are quite a number of different flavors out there. The second micro-credential is about implementing Agile, so how to set up the team, how to define the processes, how to do the planning, release planning, sprint planning, etc. How to define the requirements, now requirements being features, epic stories, and a bit about how to do testing. And then in our third micro-credential, which we're introducing today with this webinar, how to make Agile work in the real world. So what does it really take to make Agile work? And then how do we test effectively in the Agile environment without really losing our minds and keeping track of things like slippages, defects, technical debt, all of the things that are the realities of the world that we really have to deal with as testers. So why pursue an Agile credential at all? Well, one of the main reasons is because Agile is very popular out there. We do see a lot of Agile projects. We also see a lot of Agile projects that are not Agile by any means, but they call it Agile, or they use a piece here and there of the Agile methodology, but not the overall framework. So what we're trying to do is make sure that you understand the difference between how it should be in a pure Agile environment and how it often is in reality, and then how you can work with the reality. So this is definitely not a set of lessons on how to set up Agile, how to implement it yourself. Definitely not the purest approach here, but rather it's a practical view of how you can work with it, how testers have to work with it, and really how the team has to work together. And just a warning here, if you're an Agile purist, this is not intended to replace all of the books about Agile. This is not in complete alignment with all of the Agile protocols. There are definitely differences based on what works and what is more effective in the real world, whereas some of the Agile methodologies are tuned to very small projects, a lot of flexibility, things that you may not have when you've got a set schedule, a set budget, and an ERP you're implementing, for example. So this is practical. It's designed for the practical tester, and that's the overall approach. So is this for you? Well, do you find yourself with some of these questions? Are you assigned to an Agile team, but you're not sure how to make it work? How you can work effectively? How the team can work effectively? Are you finding that you just don't have time to get your testing done? And you're finding that you're picking up more and more and more debt as the project proceeds because you're just not able to get caught up on the testing? Are you unclear on who should be doing what? Has that not been well defined? Are you unclear on who you work for? Where you fit into the organization? And do you just want some practical advice? So if any of these questions fit you, this is probably going to be a really good micro-credential for you. So what are those first questions? Who do I work for? And this, again, in the micro-credential, we go into this in a lot more depth, but just as an introduction here in this webinar, really difficult out there because as a tester, you may find yourself assigned to a Scrum team. Great. But who keeps track of your career? Who keeps track of promotions? Who makes sure you get paid? What about training that's outside of what the Scrum team is doing? How does that all work? And what we find is there's a lot of matrix management that can be effective here, where you're a dot line reporting into a Scrum team, but a solid line reporting into a test team or a center of excellence or whatever it's called. But basically, your administrative reporting is into people who understand testing. And you have a camaraderie here with the testers, whereas your daily work is assigned into this Scrum team. Now, we do see situations where an individual has been told to report to the product owner or to the Scrum Master. Neither of those are actually management roles in the Scrum team. In the Scrum team, basically everyone is equal. Everyone is working together. So when you try to create this kind of false hierarchy within a Scrum team, it can be quite difficult to work with because it's really not the way it's designed. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to be effective in a self-managed team without the support of people that know what you do. This way, you get both. You have the best of all worlds. You're able to work with the Scrum team. You're able to have the excitement of the Agile project, the product you're developing, working closely with your team, but you still have the administrative support and whatever else you need from the real test team, the core test team. So this is a common model that's used, but it is called matrix management when we start to get these dotted line reporting things. And you do want to be really clear on who is making the decisions about what you're doing, who is making your assignments, who is making your career decisions, who is planning your next project. So making really sure that you understand that will make you a lot more satisfied in your job. Now, some of the most critical things in an Agile project is to ensure that you have some quality control. And that's usually done with the combination of the definition of ready and the definition of done. And these become basically the quality gates. So the definition of ready basically means that a story can't advance until all of the criteria are met. And for example, for these, it might be that grooming is complete, the priority has been assigned by the product owner, risk has been assessed and recorded and agreed by the team, the acceptance criteria have been defined, unit testing has been completed. And usually with unit testing being completed, it's also got some coverage parameters as well. Now, the definition of ready can be defined at multiple stages in the life cycle of a story, but you commonly see it from the point where the story is defined and before it goes into development. So that's really a key definition of ready. And then the next one is when it comes from development into testing. So you tend to see it in those two places. But you can define a definition of ready for anything that makes sense as a step or a stage in the process. Now, people that are working with Kanban boards, for example, you often have a definition of ready for each stage in the workflow. But it's whatever works. And often what is done is you kind of define this as you go. So you want to define it up front, obviously, but you may need to refine it as you go because you say, you know what, I'm getting software through from the developers and I know they haven't unit tested it. Great, then we need to add that to our definition of ready, and they may need to prove it, that they've actually achieved the level of coverage that we expect. Now, on the other end of it is the definition of done. And this indicates that the story has completed whatever the criteria are, and we are able as a team to collect the story points for it. We get the credit for having completed it. Now, samples of this, there's no outstanding high priority defects. All the defects are documented and agreed by maybe the product owner. The plan tests have been executed. Test automation for this story has been completed. That's a big one there because it's really hard to keep up with the automation as you're doing development. You have to work with the team to define these so they make sense, but keep that testing perspective because we want to make sure that the definition of done doesn't end up being a developer definition, which might be code is complete, static analysis has been done. But it's not done, right? We have to go through testing. We have to go through assessing the defects that are found. That's the things that create actually a done story, a completed story. But these definition of ready, definition of done, these are two of the really important areas where testing can influence the quality control of a story. So definitely take a part of this. Don't just accept the definitions that might already be defined. Look at what needs to be added in there, what you really want to have in place so that you can say when the story is done and you're happy with it, you're content, it's ready to go out to the users. Now, slipping is a big problem in Agile projects. I was working on a project where we actually weren't brought in to do testing until about sprint 9 of 10. So already there's problems there, right? But when we got in there, it was supposed to be near completion, right? And that's why they brought us in to do help with the UAT. Well, great. Get in there. It hasn't even been functionally tested at all. Nothing's been tested. There was no definition of done. There was nothing. The developers were just claiming stories were done. Nobody had verified it. I mean, just a mess, as you can imagine. And it turned out a lot of the stories were only partially done. They hadn't really been completed. They had this truly avalanche of slippage. And what they ended up doing was they just began adding new sprints. So we came in at 9. It was supposed to be done at 10. So 11 got added, 12 got added, 13 got added. Last I heard, it was on about 21. And that was just basically doing stuff that they should have done to start with. And then as the users started getting some of the functionality, there were a lot of changes that came in because the requirements initially hadn't been very good. But that is not atypical in an Agile project. You tend to see some big slips in here. And this is something that really frustrates everyone on the project. So one of the things that we can do to help with slipping is using the release approach. So traditionally, we have the sprint approach. And that's where we have sprint 1 here. We're doing sprint 1. We get our testing. Okay, we test everything that's new in sprint 1. We do a little UAT with the users. We prep for production. Out it goes. Okay, now this is kind of a continuous deployment model here. Sprint 2. We got sprint 2 testing to do, the functional stuff for sprint 2. Oh, now we've got to do regression testing for stuff in sprint 1. Got the UAT, got the prod prep, out it goes. Okay, sprint 3 comes. Oh, now we've got to do the regression testing for sprint 2 and sprint 1, plus the new stuff from sprint 3, and plus we've still got to do UAT and prod prep. It's getting longer. Sprint 4 gets worse, sprint 5 gets worse. And by this time, we're in trouble. We're behind because we haven't had time to do what needs to be done. That means we're finding bugs down here in sprint 5 that we should have found back in sprint 3, but we couldn't get there because we couldn't do enough regression testing because there wasn't enough time. So this approach tends to result in slips. And as you can imagine, the more sprints you have, the bigger the slips are because you get further and further behind as the development goes forward. So this is one of the problems that we have as testers in an Agile project. Now, the other things we have to think about, it's not just this volume of regression testing we have to do. What about end-to-end UAT? Okay, now we've been doing this UAT all along, right? But when we're doing user acceptance testing in a sprint, the user's just looking at the stuff in the sprint. Okay, great. That doesn't allow them to do basically what UAT is supposed to be, which is business transactions. It's that reality of testing against what a user's really going to do. We can't do that until we have enough functionality. So that's coming out here to get to the enough functionality to do it. But, oh man, that doesn't fit in the schedule. So I'm assuming this is a 5-sprint release, obviously. Oh no, but what about test automation? We didn't have time to do that because we were frantically trying to do the regression testing. We didn't have time to automate it, so we had to do it by hand, which meant we just didn't get any gain as we went along. Oh, that's a problem. Oh, and performance and security testing. Again, maybe we could do some of that in the sprint, but in truth, a lot of performance testing and security testing requires a lot of the software to be together. So you've got to have transactions, for example, to do performance testing. Security testing, you want all the integrated components so that you can make sure you haven't introduced any vulnerabilities. This just doesn't fit. Now we start slipping and slipping and slipping. But we only said it was going to take 5 sprints. Oh, it was only going to take 10 weeks. Now suddenly it's a lot longer than that. I'm assuming 2-week sprints here. But with the release approach, oh, okay, now this is different. We basically said up front, okay, 5 sprints, that's going to be new stuff going in. So we're going to have 5 sprints. But we're also going to have what's called a hardening sprint. And this is used to do the final regression testing, the end-to-end performance, the security automation. All of these things happen out here in these hardening sprints. Now, within the development sprints, I'm not doing user acceptance testing. I'm not doing production deployment. I'm not having to support what's gone into production. And I've got time to do automation development because I actually have some time to do that. So I've taken away having to do production support, having to do UAT support, having to do production deployment prep, and putting that into automation. And I can also do my early security and early performance testing because I've got more time now. But I still do need this hardening sprint down here and the UAT and the performance specialty areas in order to actually do the final parts. Now, you're going to say, okay, well, isn't this going to take the same amount of time? No, because it's controlled. So this way I can say I've got 10 weeks of development sprints. I've got a 2-week or 3-week hardening sprint. I've got another week for UAT, performance security. I can define this up front. And this is a logical set of software here, so that when it goes out to the users, they only have to do UAT once. They've got business transactions they can run against it. They only have to deal with the deployment once, and that makes it easier for everybody and much more predictable. Whereas in the previous model, with the sprint model, we tend to have chaos when it gets towards the end because stuff isn't getting done. Things are not getting completed within sprints. Everything's beginning to slip, and we're picking up a huge amount of technical debt. And that's got to be addressed somewhere. Whereas with the release approach, we can have a more orderly approach because we're scoping down what we have to do in each sprint because we've only got the one release. We've got a hardening sprint that we're allocating, and then we know we've got that extra testing coming in at the end. So we have a much better way of accounting for what it's going to take. And it's a much more realistic approach. To go in there and say, hey, I'm going to do this in 5 sprints, 2 weeks each, boom, done. That's not realistic. We know that right from the start. This is a much more realistic approach. So I love the release approach. It's an easy way to implement control and implement a way to keep everything from slipping. Now, everybody's going to like this better. The business gets what they're expecting to get. Management doesn't have an unhappy business. The developers can work within a realistic schedule, and the testers can also work within a realistic schedule without accumulating a whole bunch of debt. So the release approach, great way to do it, great way to control. Now, also in a very, very big project that's going to span months and months and months, having multiple releases will keep it on schedule. That way you've got milestones, you know when features are going to be released, and you're able to end up knowing that maybe every quarter you have a release. You've got it planned that way, rather than saying, well, we're just going to go forward releasing continuously, because generally that ends up in a continuous slip. Like our project that's, sprint 20 or so. So you want to make sure that you have this kind of control in place, milestones, ways to check this. Business gets a nice feature. Everybody in this team is still sane and ready to go on to the next feature. Now, grooming is not a way to get to know your teammates. Just wanted to clarify that. But what it is fleshing out the story. Stories are quite brief. It's I want to, so I can. Not a lot of detail in there, right? So the grooming is when we actually sit down and say, okay, well, what is this thing really? What's the priority of it? What are the acceptance criteria? How will I know when it actually does what it needs to do? And this tells development what they need to develop. It tells us what we need to test. It tells the business what they're going to get. We need agreement, obviously, across the product owner, development test, whoever else is involved. The goal here is to clearly define what is expected and to make sure we know when we get there. Because if we don't define what it is, how will we know if we ever got it? So that's our goal here from grooming. We want to walk away from a grooming session going, okay, I understand what this story means. I understand what it's going to take. I understand how to test it. And I understand how to know if it works. That's what we're coming out of the grooming session with. Each story has to be groomed. So this isn't something that it's just a one and done kind of thing. It's a continuous process with the stories to groom them, make sure that they've got everything that they need before implementation starts. Now, leapfrogging, we talked about this a bit earlier, but it's a way to avoid falling behind, quite frankly, because we end up with a lot of extra work to do in a sprint. And we have the regression testing, and we have the performance, and we have security, and we have all those things that we should, and oh, that's right, automation, all those things we should be getting to. In some cases, you just flat out cannot do it in 2 weeks. You need 4 weeks, for example. Well, leapfrogging is a way to deal with this, and it basically splits a testing team into 2 teams so that the first team takes sprint 1, the second team takes sprint 2, and then the first team takes sprint 3, the second team takes sprint 4, and so on. So you alternate sprints, and that way you end up with twice the amount of time to complete the testing that's needed on the sprint. And you've always got people free and ready to go to attend the planning and the analysis and design and all those sessions. Because what often happens in Agile projects is the testers spend so much time testing, they don't have time to go to any of the planning. They don't go to the grooming session. And now suddenly the thing lands in your lap and you're going, well, the acceptance criteria aren't even defined well. Well, that's because you weren't in that session to ask all those pesky questions to get the acceptance criteria defined. Using a leapfrog approach really works well to allow you to actually get the work done for a sprint and still be ready for the next one. Now, this works even if you've only got 2 testers, right? They just switch back and forth depending on which sprint is coming up. And that way you're able to always have somebody ready to jump on the next one. Now, one point in here, you have to be sure you allow time for defects to be fixed. One of the drawbacks of leapfrogging is if it's a 2-week sprint, for example, then testing is going to actually go for 4 weeks because you're going to do all of your functional testing, your regression testing, and whatever else you need to do. Now, ideally, it's automation that's coming towards the end because you want to find all the defects early. You want to find them within the first sprint. But in some cases, you don't. You don't get it all done. So you're finding defects in sprint 2 or in that sprint 2 time frame that were actually in the sprint 1 code. So do have to make sure that the developers have time allowed in their schedules to fix defects that are going to come in a bit later. So that is one drawback maybe, or just another reality of dealing with it. Some other testing considerations. So risk-based testing is always a great approach because you go after the highest risk stuff first. This can be technical risk, this will be business risk, but basically we're saying I got to be sure that the riskiest stuff is covered, and I've got to make sure that I test that as thoroughly as I need to. There's also pair testing, which is sometimes used, and that can be a pair of 2 testers working together. It could be a tester working with a developer, could be a tester working with a user. The idea is that you've got 2 sets of eyes on the software and working together. Works really well if you have compatible people. I will give it that caveat. But it really helps a lot to get that second opinion all the time. Automation is the other thing that we always have to be thinking about, because if we don't have automation trucking right along with us, we're going to be in trouble because our regression test burden only gets bigger and bigger and bigger every single sprint. So we have to have a way to get automation done early, but not so early that it's just going to break. So it's that fine line, right, to start automating as soon as it makes sense so that we can start using it for regression testing, but also not starting too soon because then it's just going to be a maintenance nightmare. Other stuff to think about: what level of detail do we need in the tests? You might call them test cases, you might call them test scripts, you might just call them tests, but do they need to have step-by-step instructions? Do they just need to have a checklist of things to look at? Do they just need to have an exploratory session explanation, an objective? What level do we need? And a lot of this comes back to what's the risk of what we're testing? Who's the tester? Is this stuff going to be used in the future? There's a lot of factors that go into figuring out the level of detail in tests, but it's definitely something we want to think about, because if you put too much detail in, you're just making a maintenance issue for yourself later. Software is going to change, and it will change considerably in Agile. So we don't want to put more detail than we need, but we do need enough detail so that our tests are repeatable, for example. So got to factor that in. What level of detail do we need? Also, using tools. We want to make sure that the tools we use are adequate and appropriate for what we're doing. We want to make sure that we can do good defect management, good test case management, that we've got good reporting, good dashboards. All of that needs to be handled within the tools. We don't want to be doing all this stuff in Excel. There's lots of good tools out there, and fairly inexpensive tools as well. Definitely something to look at to make sure that the tools that we've got are the right tools, and they're going to actually help us, not make us cry at the end of the day. The other thing to think about is, how are we going to manage our regression tests? Are they going to be grouped into suites? Are they going to be part of the general test cases and they're going to just have a tag that says this is a regression test case? How do we know when they're automated? How do we take them out of the manual testing pool? All of those things need to be thought about of how we're going to manage regression testing before we get started, because this is going to save us a lot of time. It's not something you want to get halfway through and go, oh, we should have been tagging those as we went along. Stuff we want to think about early. And then my current favorite, root cause analysis. So for everything we catch, we need to understand, why did this happen in the first place? What caused the issue to occur? How do we prevent it? How do we make sure it doesn't happen in the future? And then what can we learn? What can we do better? So for example, if you get a defect through and you say, Basically, the developers just missed a requirement. They missed one of the acceptance criteria. For example, one of our acceptance criteria defined the format for the address, and they didn't do that. Okay, well, why did that happen? Did the acceptance criteria not get to the developer? Did it get defined after the developer had already coded it? What happened there? So we need to understand how this happened, and then how do we prevent it? Well, if the developer started coding before the acceptance criteria were defined, okay, we've got a problem there, right? Because that means grooming probably wasn't complete, wasn't started on time, something's not in place there that needs to be in place. It also means that the definition of ready probably either wasn't applied or doesn't have enough information in it. Every time we get a defect, we want to look at it and say, okay, where did it come from? Why did it happen? How do we make this not happen in the future? Root cause analysis is good always in any methodology. It's particularly critical in Agile because we are very time sensitive. And the fastest way to test is on software that works. It takes a lot more time to test software that breaks because you have to start and try it again. You have to write up the defect. You have to get the fix. You have to retest the defect. It's just a lot of time. There's a lot of overhead in defect management. So if I can prevent a defect by learning something from my root cause analysis, that's only going to make the project go better. And don't forget, it's not just the defects that you find, it's also the defects that you missed. So things that are found in production or found by another team or maybe in integration later, we want to look at those as well. So just because you didn't catch it doesn't mean you shouldn't look at it. You want to look at every defect that's found. And that's it for this webinar. Again, Agile projects are great fun. There's really nothing more fun than an Agile project, but they're really hard. It's really hard to do it right and do it well. And you've got to have the right project, the right team, the right approach. But hopefully, when you listen to the Micro-Credential 3, you'll be able to take away some things that will really help you get that right approach in place. Make sure that the team is right and they are working correctly. And it'll also help you look at different projects and some that will fit and some that just don't fit very well into the Agile framework. Most projects can fit into an Agile framework. Most teams can actually fit into an Agile framework, but they have to want to. They have to understand what the rules are, and they have to be ready to change. They have to be ready to succeed, and they have to be ready to really work together. So hopefully this is interesting for you and you'll take the third Micro-Credential. Thank you for your time.